Hey folks, as you know, tomorrow will be the debate, so make sure you are prepared for that. Again, what we're trying to determine is to assess whether or not Stalin's economic reforms were in fact successful. Now, again, just a reminder that you're going to have to figure out some way of defining what the terms of that success may or may not have been. We left at the end of class with a couple of things that we had yet to have discussed, which are really, really important in terms of understanding the overall characteristics of the Stalinist regime. We left off by looking at a picture of the Central Committee of the Communist Parties with the leading communists in 1917, those of the old Bolsheviks as they're called, those who led the revolution, and we see that by the following decades, most of these people, by 1934, most of them had been eliminated or had simply died of natural causes. Stalin was very ruthless in his elimination of anybody who he saw as a potential threat. Now, some students were still yet a little bit unsure of why, in fact, these great purges had happened. If you remember, we talked about this leading Bolshevik, Sergei Kirov, who was very popular. There had been some discussion in 1934 of removing Stalin from leadership. People felt that they wanted to, at least in the Communist Party, portray a better image to the public. And Stalin was determined that he was in fact the only man who could lead the Soviet Union through its industrialization. He was absolutely paranoid of a potential German attack in the future. And so the purges were launched, and they started with show trials and elimination of some leading Bolsheviks. But by 1938, they had simply taken a life of their own. He had very, very little control of them, and they had really sort of damaged and weakened the USSR at a time when international system was deteriorating and war seemed to be on the horizon. This may have played a role into the decision of why in August of 1939, Stalin cuts a deal with Germany, which he thinks will delay the war. We'll look at that later on. It was, of course, called the Nazi-Soviet Pact. But we do see that Stalin tries to end them. He blames the excesses of the purges on his NKVD chiefs, whom he has eliminated, including Nikolai Yezhov, the leading NKVD chief, who had simply recently replaced Yagoda after Stalin had him removed and murdered. By 1938, there was mass fear across Russia, and it's estimated by many Russian historians that somewhere in the ballpark of 20 million people had by that point, over this 4-year period, been sent to the gulags. So what were the gulags? Well, the gulags were a system of labor camps run by the NKVD. This really is what was at the heart of Stalin's reign of terror. If you weren't immediately tried and executed, most people were sent to the gulags, which provided the Soviet system with a massive supply of slave laborers who literally dug and built by hand some of the great cities that were built under the Stalinist regime, such as Magnitogorsk, which literally was built out of nothing. As well, they built canals and roads and railways simply using the most rudimentary tools. These were very, very inhospitable, and you're talking about people being shipped there in boxcars, treated like cattle. Important to remember as well that Hitler borrows a lot of these ideas. The concentration camps are not really that unique, and they, at any rate, paled in comparison in terms of the number of people that they both killed, as well as the number of people who were interned in these. It's estimated at one camp, Kolyma in Siberia, that somewhere in the ballpark of about 1 million people died there. The Gulag system was essential to the 5-year plans. As I said before, it provided the USSR with a lot of its labor. But these conditions were very, very bleak, and you can read here below on this slide some of the things that the inmates were subjected to. Here we see a picture of one of the gulags. Of course, very few pieces of evidence or artifacts from these still exist, as most people were simply unable to record their experiences there or didn't survive to tell about them. Here we see a map of what was called the Gulag Archipelago, this vast system of literally islands of gulags spread across this massive Soviet territory. Here Piers Brennan, the historian Piers Brennan, describes in his Dark Valley the conditions which people were subjected to in these. One of the other things you guys will read about when you look at your materials is the population transfers that Stalin initiated right across the entire Soviet Empire. It's interesting to note that after World War II, he does this in a number of the countries that he has direct control over, such as Germany and Poland, and he moves literally millions of people who are scattered across Europe and places them directly into the national countries of origin, even though these were people who probably hadn't lived inside something called Germany for centuries. But he does this within his own Soviet empire as well, and largely to move people who he felt would have been a threat. For example, if there was Georgians or Chechens or peoples that he thought would rebel against the interests of the state, then he would just up and move literally millions of people. And some estimates are as high as 43% of these people died of diseases and malnutrition along the way. But this is essentially just another way in which Stalin transforms the landscape of the Soviet Union. Now, one of the ways that Stalin kept control of the Soviet Union, as we've already seen, is through terror and also through his control of mass media. Mass media was used primarily to promote what we would call a cult of personality, which was a fundamental characteristic of most 20th century totalitarian regimes. Now, it grew out of this cult of Lenin that we've already seen how that originated, that Lenin was sort of turned into this mythic hero. But Stalin uses this to not only glorify Lenin, but also draw some connections between himself and Lenin and replace the worship of perhaps religion or God with the worship of the leader as a godlike figure. And Stalin uses this to great success, remembering, of course, that this was a time and a people who were not necessarily as sophisticated in their use of media and their understanding of propaganda as we are today. So we see in his cult of personality, we see parades, we see films, we see a great many ways in which media was put to use. Here we have the quote from Pavel Latinov, a schoolboy in the Stalinist era, who said that Stalin was like a god for us. We just believed he was an absolute perfect individual, and he lived somewhere in the Kremlin. A light is always in his window, and he was thinking about us, each of us. We see here this sort of brainwashing of society that occurred as a result of this. And art was used to great success as well. Here we see Stalin as father of the nation, this caring man who cared for the youth and cared for the people that he ruled over. In times of war, we saw Stalin as the guide and wise leader, and especially this image was especially common during the 5-year plans, as Stalin tried to portray himself in the image of somebody who, the only person really, who could guide Russia to modernization and to greatness amongst other nations. Here we see Stalin as the wise and tactful and strategist of World War II, guiding the Soviet armies to victory. But it was also necessary for Stalin to draw some connections to, of course, the mythic figure of Lenin through art and through other means of media. Of course, Stalin and Lenin were never that close, as we've already seen what Lenin thought of Stalin in his last will and testament. Beyond that, Stalin also created literally dozens and dozens of monuments right across Russia, including one that was used at the National Exhibition in Paris in the 1930s, which was directly opposite of the Nazi exhibition. So what should we think of this era? Was it a continuation of Lenin's era? Here Robert Conquest thinks that Lenin's terror was the product of years of war and violence, of the collapse of society and administration, of the desperate acts of rulers precariously riding the flood and fighting for control and survival. Stalin, on the contrary, attained complete control at a time when general conditions were calm. In other words, Lenin's ruthlessness was a result of the war and the violence and the collapse of Russian society coming out of the First World War and the Russian Civil War. Stalin, on the other hand, committed his acts of violence at a time when things were relatively calm. Here we have a quote from Alexander Solzhenitsyn, a survivor of the gulags, saying essentially that godlessness was the prime mover in the terror of Stalin's era. And so lastly, we come to our original questions that we considered yesterday. Was this a disaster for the USSR? Was it a continuation of Leninism? Was Stalin simply a red czar?